The 12-day war putting Israel and the US against Iran, it's over. Now the questions begin over what it did and it did not accomplish. The good news that you and I, we can agree that both Israel and the US showed they can bombard Iranian nuclear facilities and other targets as well. But meanwhile, if we study history carefully, history teaches it is nearly impossible to eradicate a nuclear program by air power alone. At this moment, it is no surprise that Iran is waiting for the moment to retaliate against the US. But a better question we need to ask, 2025, what kind of wars should US get involved at this moment? Now keep in mind, when we look at wars, particularly the war in Ukraine, it's rather devastating to see what's happening still in both nations. But meanwhile, people are asking the question, is it time for US to step in again to terminate the war and the world order will be restored? Is that really the case? Is it time for US to examine itself? Maybe it's time to pull out of the wars which doesn't involve a US at this moment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's Dr. Dan Reiter. Dr. Reiter is a Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Political Science at Emory University. His scholarly interests including interstate conflict, gender, and international relations, and his new book, which is called Untied Hands, How States Avoid the Wrong Wars. Dr. Reiter, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Will, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, Professor. It's such an honor to have you back on the show again. Now, your book, which is entitled that How States Avoid the Wrong Wars. Now, when we look at what's going on right now between Israel and Iran, I would say, I want to be careful. At this moment, everyone is very concerned whether US should continue to evolve itself into the war between US and Iran. But meanwhile, I want to read a statement to you from the Iranian government, and it says that they believe that US would interpret as weakness, air quote, American is like a dog. If you back off, it will lunge at you, but if you lunge at it, it will recoil and back off. Professor Reiter, from your perspective, let's assess the war at this moment, and also how do we understand the statement, such what I read from the Iranian government? Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, Will, the book that I just published has a perhaps surprising message for many of its readers, which is that, and it's a good news message, and the good news message is something along the lines of, the sky is not falling, or at least it's not falling in all ways. And one of the central arguments of the book is that when states wish to avoid involvement in larger wars, they are actually quite good at avoiding inadvertent escalation when they want to. Now, they don't always want to, but when they want to. And the sky is not falling part is that what we see, not only in the Iran-Iraq war, but in many conflicts in 2025, we did not have this escalation to a broader war that some pundits feared. Do you remember the India-Pakistan conflict earlier this year? There were a number of observers who were saying we're on the brink of nuclear war in South Asia. That war fizzled out. And the main reason is that neither India nor Pakistan wanted a broader war, and they were able to avoid it. The Ukraine war has unfortunately ground on for more than 2.5 years. It is, of course, a very bloody and very destructive war, which is terrible in its own right. It has not escalated to involve NATO because neither Russia nor NATO want to become involved. The war between Iran and the United States did not escalate to a broader war because neither side wanted it to escalate. So that is one of the arguments that I make in the book, which is that when states wish to avoid broader escalation, and again, they don't always, they are able to avoid it.
Dr. Reiter, we're in the year of 2025, and of course that tie in that with the content in your book. when we talk about wars today, the first thing, again, regardless if you are a politician or if you're an average citizen, everyone understands and believes the strategy. It's called diplomacy. Now, people believe that when conflict arises, or when we see wars, the first approach, or we say the first attempt, is to try to minimize the threat by using the diplomatic ways. And of course, that today, when we look at Iran, some believe that Iran is not seeing President Trump's call for peace as a welcome diplomatic off-ramp. Only after it has regained a measure of deterrence, potentially by acquiring a nuclear weapon, might Iran be ready to talk. So, Professor, from your perspective, when we look at wars and when we look at the international wars, how should we understand the strategy of diplomacy, again, looking at the history, and why do you think that when we talk about diplomatic approach or diplomacy, that might not be good enough to satisfy the partners? Your thoughts?
Yeah, let's talk about this in the context of states pursuing nuclear weapons, which of course is what we're most concerned about with Iran. And, here what we see from past history is that sometimes diplomacy does provide a useful off-ramp and sometimes it does not. Sometimes you do have states who possess nuclear weapons or who are pursuing nuclear weapons who are genuinely willing to get rid of their nuclear programs through diplomacy. So Libya gave up its nuclear weapons program in the 2000s. South Africa and Ukraine handed over their nuclear arsenals. Argentina and Brazil exited their nuclear arms race in the 80s and 90s. All of those states, genuinely worked with the diplomatic process. However, sometimes there are states who do not want to give up their nuclear weapons programs, and they do not engage in diplomacy genuinely. North Korea is probably the most salient example. Iraq in the 1980s and 1990s is another example, more or less, though by the mid-90s they were giving up their nuclear program, without really recognizing it with the international community. So it's a complicated answer to this question, which is that, yes, sometimes diplomacy can work, but sometimes you don't have two willing partners, as it were. The key question for Iran is, well, is Iran a willing partner? Are they willing to give up their nuclear weapons program through diplomacy? That's also deceptively complicated. The Obama administration signed a diplomatic agreement with Iran in 2015 with some other partners, in which Iran agreed to substantially pull back many of its nuclear weapons-related activities in return for the reduction of economic sanctions. Now, the Trump administration exited that pact, the first Trump administration, even though everyone agreed, including the Trump White House, that they were cooperating. The Trump White House leveled a number of critiques of the deal and so forth, but at that point, there was at least room for a deal. Okay, it is no longer the 2010s. It's now the 2020s. The diplomatic context is different. And now the big question is there a diplomatic off-ramp right now in 2025? Is there some kind of diplomatic deal in which Iran would give up its nuclear weapons program in exchange for the right package of incentives? I think this is, kind of the heart of your question. And what we see is factors moving in opposite directions. One factor indicating they are not likely or not motivated to do that is that they had a deal in 2015 and they did not cheat on it, and the Trump administration exited quickly. So it looks like the U.S. is not a good partner for Iran. Also, the North Korea experience would seem to demonstrate that the most important thing is to get a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible, and then the U.S. will leave you alone. North Korea got a nuclear weapon, the U.S. left it alone. Iran and Libya did not get nuclear weapons, and their regimes were overthrown by the U.S. On the other hand, the other side of this is that those factors notwithstanding, there are other motives for Iran to negotiate in good faith. One is that the U.S. is demonstrating its willingness, and Israel willingness and ability, to at least degrade their nuclear weapons program. There's a lot of debate now as to how much it was degraded. We don't really know. Another factor is that the Iranian economy is under tremendous pressure, and Iranian society is under tremendous pressure, and so there may be more of incentive to cut a deal in order to relieve that pressure and lift economic tension. So I wish I had kind of a pat yes/no answer to this question of is there a diplomatic on ramp. I'm afraid it's quite complicated.
Well, again, Dr. Reiter, it is a complicated matter indeed. Now, again, I want to go back to your book. Just look at the content. I know you devoted several chapters to explain this, but again, I always say we tend to learn the lessons, or we tend to examine the lessons after we make a mistake. And of course, that's part of the human nature, right? I mean, no one's perfect. But when it comes to wars, it involves casualty, involves, sacrifice and the strategies. And of course, one thing that people don't really want to see, or people are not interested in seeing, is death on either side. So going back to your book, Professor, could you give us one or two simple examples that throughout the history that you covered in the book, some of the wars that could have been avoided, but because the wrong approach or because the wrong strategy, that it took place and eventually led to devastation? I'm sure that in your book you mentioned many of them, but what would be one of the two good examples that to relevant what's happening today and also serve a reminder or serve a lesson to all of us to be careful when we look at what's happening today? Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if the question is, what are some conflicts where the aggressor regrets launching the conflict, we don't have to go that far back in history. I think Vladimir Putin regrets having invaded Ukraine or tried to conquer all of Ukraine in 2022. And, his willingness to consider seriously a peace deal in March of 2022 indicates that. And certainly there were a variety of alternative routes he could have taken to advance Russian goals. So the Russian goals, short of invasion. I think the Hamas attack on October 2023, we know from public reports that some of Hamas leadership has openly regretted it. That has led to, unfathomable destruction in Gaza, the Palestinian people, and Hamas itself. So those are just some very recent examples, in which, leaders looked at it. Now, one example that I looked at, from American history is the decision to escalate in the Vietnam War. So this is in the book. And, one thing that I talk about in the book is that, in 1964, 1965, the Johnson White House, they were not terribly confident that this war would go well. And they were not terribly confident, that we would be able to avoid a lot of American casualties. So it probably went worse than they imagined, but they were not supremely confident. And I think, one of the lessons, of that war is that, you should be confident that you are able to succeed. And also confident that you can minimize casualties. I think one of the motivations for America's recent attack on Iran was the high confidence that there would be essentially zero American casualties. And now you mentioned that, people don't like wars where there are casualties on both sides. I would amend that slightly and say that the American public can sometimes be surprisingly callous to casualties on the alternative side, but they're very averse to casualties on the U.S. side. So, for example, in the 2000s and 2010s, the Bush and Obama administrations launched thousands and thousands of drone strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere, which led to no American military deaths, but many, many civilian deaths. So wars become more likely, certainly, when the White House is confident that American casualties will not be at risk.
Well, Dr. Reiter, since we talk about what is relevant today, especially you mentioned the Vietnam War, and the war in Ukraine, let's talk about another country, which is the elephant in the room, China. And we know that today, when we look at this political tension between US and China, we're looking at this economic competition between US and China. But lastly, let's talk about what we called great power competition between the two countries. What happened in Iran, or what happened between Israel and Iran, surely it's not a surprise to China today. China is not only a bench player, and also China tried to be carefully playing this mediator. Again, at this moment, China surely doesn't want to see the world fall apart. It doesn't want to see the tension between US and Iran, or Israel and Iran, continue to escalate. But Dr. Reiter, from your perspective, when we do look at modern conflict, and when we look at this power competition, how do we assess the country like China? I mean, China tried to be a good mediator. China tried to be a good bench player without direct involvement. But in reality, that doesn't work, because meanwhile, China is also facing its own internal conflict, or its own internal struggle within the power circle. So again, the question to you is, what role does China play, and how do we see that China will carry out the power, especially when we look at those wars? Your thoughts?
Well, this is another sky is not falling implication of my book. And sometimes pundits will look at US-China competition and say, well, we're on the brink of World War III, the Thucydides trap, and so on and so forth. And one of the implications of my book is that the sky is not falling, that the likelihood of military conflict between the US and China is actually quite low. And the reason it's quite low is that it's relatively simple. Neither the US or China want to have serious military conflict with each other, and they are very effective at avoiding escalation. We've had decades of competition in the South China Sea over the resources under the South China Sea floor, which have not escalated because all sides have managed the conflict quite well. Regarding relation, and the reason that they do not want conflict is it would be so terribly costly. And you mentioned internal instability within China, and the best way for the Chinese Communist Party to address that is to enjoy rapid economic growth and to keep inflation down. And the best way to do that is a peaceful world in which there can be more flow of trade. And that has had a special connection to the Israel-Iran-US conflict. China buys a substantial amount of Iranian oil, which flows out of the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz. And so they are very strongly motivated to allow the passage of those oil tankers to proceed without being blocked by military conflict. So, I am somewhat more confident that we can maintain peaceful relations with China. And I'm also, I agree with you that it's hard to know how much direct influence China has, but I think there is an indirect influence. Iran wants to keep shipping oil to China. China wants to keep buying it. And as long as both sides are motivated to maintain that trade, that's an incentive for Iran not to start a naval conflict in the Persian Gulf with U.S. naval ships, which might then impede the flow of oil. So there are some peaceful indirect effects.
Dr. Reiter, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's continue to talk about your book, and also I want to go back to the word diplomacy. If we remember, during the first Trump administration, China rolled out that what we called a wolf warrior diplomacy. Country in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, also rolled out that what we called a bamboo diplomacy. Another partner, it's India. India, even today, recently, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi emphasized it's critical and it's crucial for India to maintain what he called a paper tiger diplomacy. Regardless, we're seeing this wolf warrior diplomacy, this bamboo diplomacy, this paper tiger diplomacy. At the end of the day, leaders still believe that peace through strength, it's more important than anything else. But meanwhile, not all the countries are buying into this. Not all the countries still put a question mark when they're looking at the diplomacy, looking at this peace through strength. So, Dr. Reiter, next question to you from your perspective. Since the Biden administration, even we can trace it back to Obama administration, all the way to Trump second term, peace through strength. Three simple words, looks easy on a paper, but it's more complicated carry out in action. What is your take on those three words, and how does that relate it? Again, looking at the international conflict, how can we make it more persuasive? How can we make it more effective when we look at international wars?
Yeah, I actually talk about this in the book. And one of the points I make in the book is that building up military power is an effective way of maintaining peace. And it's also a safer way to maintain peace than some people fear. Some people fear that building up military strength and making threats risks, sparking war by threatening the other side into launching a preemptive war and so forth. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that those fears are largely overblown. Okay. And think about the Iran-Iraq conflict. Okay. One of the main reasons that this has not escalated is because of American military power. That American clearly has substantial military superiority over Iran, and that has motivated Iran to de-escalate. I mean, think about it this way. Once the U.S. attacks Iran, Iran has in its toolbox a whole different, set of ways it can retaliate. And notice that it chose the means of retaliation which inflicted the least damage on the United States, missile strikes on U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf, where there were very substantial missile defenses. Okay, what they did not do is launch naval drone attacks against U.S. fighting ships in the Persian Gulf, which might have then actually, sunk ships and killed American sailors and escalated things further, or launched terrorist attacks on U.S. embassies around the world. Their response was quite muted. And the main reason it was muted is because Iran did not want to escalate, and they did not want to escalate because they recognized American military power. Iran is also recognizing Israeli military power. That's a motivation for them to de-escalate. So this, for me, peace through strength, building up military capability and then making very clear threats is actually a good way to maintain peace. And this has been demonstrated to be successful in a variety of different contexts over time.
Well, Dr. Reiter, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, this is an amazing book as we look at the modern day international conflicts around the world. The book is called Untied Hands: How States Avoid the Wrong Wars. So, Dr. Reiter, again, as we look at what's happening today in Ukraine, in Iran, in Israel, and also we're looking at major conflicts among the countries in Southeast Asia, what would you expect the readers to appreciate and understand as we continue to dive into your book? Because again, your book, it's not just about the analysis of what happened, how it happened, and how we should prevent it. What's critical to the book or to our readers is we need to look beyond the text and really examine the question, how's the history relevant to modern day affairs and the lessons that we should learn? But again, you're the author, you're the writer. So what are your expectations from the readers? And also, why is it crucial for us to understand the concept in your book? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think that, one of the takeaways from the book is that America should think carefully about what its global interests are and not be afraid of standing by those interests, and not be afraid that standing by those interests is necessarily going to spark escalation to global war. And this is what I sometimes see, is that, there were phases of the Ukraine war where people were so fearful of a nuclear war over Ukraine, People said, the United States should cut its military aid to Ukraine. Some people are so fearful of a war with China over Taiwan. People are saying, we should cut Taiwan loose and not support them. And, one of the lessons from the book going forward is it's not that America should defend every corner of the world. That's not what I am advocating at all. But we should think hard about what are the areas of the world where we do want to protect. If there is a stable, thriving, pro-American democracy that is part of the American network, we should not be afraid of committing to the defense of that country, both with military power and with statements, and standing by it. And we should not let the fear of, the risk of nuclear war frighten us into backing down. And I say that not because, I'm cavalier about the prospect of nuclear war, but that history shows that those risks are exaggerated and they're not nearly as high, as some people would say. We have stood by South Korea for decades, and South Korea has emerged as a prosperous democracy. And so that is kind of the takeaway, that we should think hard about what countries we want to stand by. And once we've made that decision, knowing we're not going to stand by everybody, then we should not be afraid of taking the measures necessary to help democracies thrive and survive in the international order.
Well said, Professor. I agree with you 100%. It is our job not only to protect the democracy at home and also continue to support the democratic systems around the world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Dan Reiter. Dr. Reiter is a Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Political Science at Emory University, and he's the author of this amazing book, which is entitled Untied Hands, How States Avoid the Wrong Wars. Well, Dr. Reiter, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to dive into your book and also pay attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.